Well, let's see what we got here. 90, 93, 95 out here. This is not normal for us outside in the temperature. All right. Okay, question on methods and techniques. This is from Faye. Faye's been she was the person who asked what I thought of that British painter, and I didn't. I hope I wasn't in any way condescending or annoying, but then she's come back with some other questions, one of which I know she's got to have meant sarcastically. Would I be right, Faye? she said in her last one, and I don't want to leave it till last, but she said, have you done a portrait of President Trump yet? That's very amusing. And I take it you're British, and that's sarcasm of the first order. It's delightful. No, I'm not an ambulance chaser. I'm never going to do a portrait of Trump. I'm never going to do a portrait if I can avoid it from a photograph. So, which is what most of these guys are doing now. So, sorry for all those guys who love the photograph and believe that's the be-all and end-all, and this, the way you actually have success. And that's what you get for letting the business people take over the portraits market too. Anyway, all right. That didn't sound very good, did it? All right. So here are her list of questions, and I may just attack them one as they come up. What was the syllabus like at the Art Students League, or with Mr. Gammell? And I'm going to answer. I mean, some of the stuff is going to come up in a Gabriel comment or request in the next or the one after it. So some of these things may be redundant, but I'm going to just deal with it as it comes. I was talking online when we were talking about David Hockney. I was talking about the educational system, and the art school versus the atelier, the private studio that teaches painting. And so the syllabus, that's an interesting question, because what you had at the Art Students League was, I think at the time I was there, there were like 60 different teachers. About half of them were modern abstract painters. And Hans Hofmann being one of the more famous ones. I'm not sure he was still teaching then, but it was right around that time. And the name you'd know best in that group. There was a few sculptors. John Hovanes had been there, and some others. But each of them just taught in their own little. They had spaces, studios, where their class would be held, and when they were gone, somebody else's class would be held there. And but the word syllabus is an interesting one. I think the Art Students League was the closest thing to an atelier system, and I thought from time to time about trying to reproduce it in a pure atelier system, but there wasn't a syllabus in the sense that first you did this and then you did that. You just studied with this. You grabbed onto somebody just as if they were an atelier, and you went and studied in their class. And what they would do typically, in all the ones I worked in, all you did was you painted the figure or you painted the portrait, and that was it. Dan Green's class wasn't called portrait painting as far as I know. It was just Dan Green's class. And but that's what everybody did. That was what the Art Students League entire model really was, is painting and drawing the figure. And I have to say, that there are some advantages to that. I certainly found that in the case of the advantage I got when I got to Gammell's. I'd already painted and drawn the figure for several years without, in a sense, any direction. I mean, I would have argued that there was no drawing direction at the Art Students League, any class I took. Everybody was doing their painting thing. It was all focused on painting. And then there were drawing classes, but they were really the construction drawing was the idea of the day. There was no systematic training where someone would actually show you how to get to a really refined figure, except to the degree that Jacobs or the Riley method were taught. And there were a couple places where there were certain methods. I would call them methods taught. Frank Mason had a sort of a Merge, I'd call it method. Dan Green's was an evolution of the Brackman method, the broken color impressionist thing, except he decided to bring, as he said, just really crunch down on the drawing, which seemed to be the weak part of a lot of impressionism, and so many people, of course, drawing that same conclusion. But syllabus, yeah, But there was a class in anatomy taught by Robert Hale, and I went through that as long as it took. I just was always sort of there thinking anatomy mattered. I got more information watching him articulate a bone structure. I got more of an inspiration, I meant to say, watching him draw out of his head the running a line bumps down through the bone, hitting the salient points on a bone and then coming back up, and then laying the muscles, overlaying the muscles from their attachment points to their attachment points at the other end of that, say the femur or whatever, and that was really anatomy 101. So, but there wasn't an anatomy 101. There was no this and then you do that and then you do this. There was nothing like that. And I don't think there is at an art school either. But if the syllabus, if you mean by that, what are we doing to get people to make personal statements and that sort of thing? That's an art school, as I said before. The Art Students League is way closer to being legitimately a painting school. And I'm saying what's happened to the arts is, of course, that the art schools have been dominated by every kind of thing. I don't know if you saw my Sue Coe quote, Faye, if you're listening to this, you might go look. It's under that David Hockney thing where you made your comment. And she said the big thing when she was there was to blood and raw livers stuck to your whatever. Like, it just sounded great. And she said it was chaos, it sounded like. So I don't know what syllabus is to you guys either at the Royal Academy. But and with Gammell it was far more systematic. And Gammell's approach to this whole thing was a very traditional one, and that is, if you can't, that drawing, that there's a grammar to this whole thing, right? And you're basically in a grammar school, and that means you're gaining mastery over the elements of drawing. You're learning values and how to express form and how to get proportions right, and all that sort of thing. Learning line quality, learning everything related to the craft itself as you went along, and ultimately, composition based on the still life. So if you had said syllabus with Gammell, well, yeah, his model was Reynolds. There's an old model for you over in the Royal Academy. Reynolds' model was that anybody who can paint a still life can paint anything. And that actually, I believe firmly, and try to and base my training on, because a portrait, a figure, is just like an apple. That's all it is. It's just an apple on a table. That's not, there's barely any composition involved. When you have to incorporate multiple different objects at different colors and make play out of that whole package, you're in a different place from a person just sitting somebody down and trying to copy them, which is basically what I saw at the Art Students League in my less than 3 years there. So that's with that. But I think that you'd say it's standard, and you could probably find that basic idea other places. Gammell taught and you could see it online in my own website, the studio.ingbretson.com. I think there's enough of a statement there where I point out that we draw from casts, which is basically cast drawing is where you get people to understand the nature, the content of the visual world, which is things like, the line of shadow, for example, or the form lies in the lights, and the shadows are for atmosphere and things like that. And you just learn basically, it's kind of a naming process, right? You learn what values means. You learn what form means for us, and how to do it, how to get light effects and all those sorts of things begin to happen there. You learn the idea of breadth. When you're modeling, you learn how to draw with breadth rather than just thousands of details. That was very much fundamental. But that was at the cast first, and the still life, and then you'd move to portrait, and you'd be working figure drawing at that point. Perhaps a year later or so, you'd be working on figure drawing, and then you'd be getting into the portrait and get into more figure work, more intense figure work if you stay long enough. The museum school is roughly what it was based on, and that was kind of a 7-year program. It was specifically a 7-year program, and you wouldn't be doing the figure much by way of painting until late on in that process. I think online you can see a figure done by Aldro Hibbard, Hibbard, a figure, nude standing figure. I think he's got two of them. One of them is, I think it's from the Whistler House in Lowell, Mass. A woman standing, a nude figure with a pitcher at her feet, I want to say, something like that. You might recognize it by that. And you can see the broken color, the attention to color, and the marks of the Boston School. You can see aspects of it do remind you very much of Tarbell and Company. So, but that's that. Mastery of nature. So that was my point. Can you give examples of drawing or painting exercises or assignments? So I think I've done that. Drawing the cast, articulating it, getting the proportions right, getting the values, studying up the values, getting the value relationships in the entire piece of paper that you do it on. But in that sense, they were exercises. You had to do casts. And the first exercise, you want to put it that way, was just, can you just draw an outline? We typically set up our casts with a very strong silhouette all the way around. And Gammell didn't much have time for you if you couldn't actually draw that shape with accuracy and without dirtying up your paper. So, but from there you'd go to spotting in the shadow line and indicating the shadow line, and then massing the shadows and turning form, that sort of thing. But and that was the exercise, right? But we didn't do exercises per se. We didn't do color exercises. I mean, most of that stuff we'd all done on our own or some other place. The Munsell wheel ideas, the mixing of colors in those places. That's historically sort of the stuff of schools again, where people find stuff in books and they use that as their base of their education. I think of that as considerably more scholarly. A lot of it's useful, but I found I learned way more painting the figure and hitting notes and trying to actually express with power and truth exactly what was happening in front of me. I found that way more of a springboard to really understanding color or understanding oil paint. But all those exercises are really good, and as I said, most of us had already played with that stuff somewhere or other. And I value that, actually. I value the conversation about the Munsell wheel, the primary colors, because oil really does work the way he talks about. So, did you produce a series on a theme? So that would, again, be a complete understanding of what art schools do. It was never our agenda to produce a series on a theme. We don't have an art agenda. When you're with someone like Gammell, your agenda is entirely, this is a grammar school. That's actually the language of Jerome, too, about the Beaux-Arts. This is a grammar school. He's teaching grammar. Basically, your job is whatever you set up. I mean, yes, to learn to actually set up things intelligently, to get colors that actually belong in the same picture and create unities, all those things. But the grammar basically is that of value relations, color relations, size relations, angles, proportions, all that stuff. That's the grammar, and unless you're good at that, you don't have their basic philosophy, and it stands the test of time. If you're trying to be artists, as if you're trying to be painters, instead of trying to be artists, art comes, as all of them would say the same thing. Art is something else. Art may be a product of a well-trained hand, but art isn't something you spend your life working on. That's basically the modern model is nobody knows how to draw or paint, but they're all doing art. It's just an interesting model, but from the point of view of painting, representational paintings, it won't hold. It's just not a good one. So you can see why we're not talking about things like doing a series on such and such or so and so. I mean, numbers of us individually did that, by the way, just because we found it amusing. You get a favorite object maybe and then design various things around it. One of my friends there with Gammell actually really enjoyed turning still lifes into little figurative things by using mannequins and stuff, and he did some really intriguing things, some of which were very sort of autobiographical and biographical in relation to our studio and to Gammell, but it was all just still life. But that's coincidental. It wasn't the agenda of the day. And that confusion that results by having an art agenda rather than, in a painter's world at least, in a representational painter's world, having an art agenda instead of a grammar agenda, it really does interfere. It keeps you from getting to that first place. I think it was Sargent who simply said that you're trying to get so good at this basic stuff of hitting notes and getting them right in relation to each other that your mind, after you get really good at these practices, these best practices, which is the grammar thing, that your mind can actually occupy itself then with things related to something very much higher, the aesthetics of the thoughts about aesthetics, thoughts about beauty and deeper and more profound ideas. So what form did the critiques take? They were hands-on critiques. They were intended to show how you were doing in terms of the accuracy of your attempts. In the course of the critique, you would actually notice that somebody would show you this color note was off and you wouldn't be able to see it. And so over time, you'd get this information about what the best practice is. Well, specifically how to be relational. If you want to see a note, if you see, by the time if you want to hit a red note, I've said this before, all you have to do is take in the other 3 or 4 red notes, and you'll be able to get that note right for all, as it were, practical purposes, because everything is right because it's right in the context. But the critiques were always like that, and we took them really personally. I mean, I had one student he left, and I know you're out there watching this, but I heard that he was just upset with me every time I left after a critique, and it was like that. I mean, it's very personal, but you had to drop all that stuff because you actually wanted to gain objectivity about where you were, how good your eyes were. Did you see? Could you reproduce what you could see it? And again, as the basis for anything, if you can't make what you can see in front of you, what are you going to do? Make things you're imagining in your heads? It was a funny world, but I think the logic doesn't go with the idea that you could. And did you need to study with Gammell in order to deconstruct and then replicate his painting methods? You know, the idea of deconstructing, and I wasn't actually after Gammell's painting methods. It never was, actually. I was after mastery of the visual impression. I say I was after mastery so I could draw whatever I saw in front of me. That was my personal thing, what I wanted to do with it. And I wasn't involving myself with Gammell at that level. But Gammell, so deconstructing his methods, I was always looking for best methods. And specifically the best methods for making a likeness, right? As again, if you don't abide that that's the first base of a representational painter, then, good luck, but that is the premise. That's the historical premise, nature being the source, and mastery of the look of nature, and not so much mastery of anatomy, as I said. It's mastery of the relationships of colors, the relationships of sizes, values, angles, all those things that preoccupies you. And and all of us did and have ideas about pictures. That is to say, we all sort of would keep on, and this conversation goes on. I wanted to say that who is that with? Is it First who's talking when he says that, or is it actually Harold Speed? But one of them is pointing out that there's a point at which you actually, I think it is Speed. There's a point at which you actually get when you actually suddenly look up and you say, and now what's the point of all this stuff? And now, when you were younger, you may have thought that was the point, but I didn't. I just said, it was almost like trying to become an NBA basketball player or a rugby player at the highest level. I mean, rugby, football over in you guys' world. And you just have to get good at stuff, best practices versus not getting killed on the field or defense, how to defend against somebody who's trying to score against you and all those things. Best practices, that's all. This is our world. And maybe that part I can leave at that. But replicating his painting methods, it wasn't his methods, it was his craft. He has a craft level. Nobody took it to be the ultimate. I mean, historically, that craft has evolved, that seeing has evolved, right? That's why we wake up suddenly to Monet and realize nobody's seen light with color yet. And that, or has never expressed with so much profundity the quality of color and light in a package. Vermeer was doing something really special in his day in the same way, but there's this evolution, and when Da Vinci talks about the line of shadow and the turning of form and the sfumato, the management of the smoke-like middle tone. I mean, this is the analysis of the visual world that actually begins to be, as I said again before, a springboard for all of us going into the future. So, we didn't take Gammell to be the be-all or end-all. I've never been an imitator of anybody, including the Boston School, who I find myself far closest to. I mean, I love these guys, but it just seemed beneath me to want to be one of them. I don't want to be Sargent. I don't want to be Soroy. I don't want to be any of these guys. I want to be a master of nature and see who I am and find out who I am. And I haven't been displeased with that, And again, if I wanted to talk about that subject, that's an art school sore spot. The art school thing is all about finding out who you are. It's not about giving you skills to empower who you are, but making some sort of a statement. So you sit there spending your time trying to be clever or trying to be unique. I mean, you're already unique, The poetry that comes out of you, at least as a person who's painting what they see in front of them, the poetry that's being drawn forth is a product of your uniqueness, of you could argue the way you see it. I don't mean the way your eyes work. I mean, but the way you the things that give you joy, the things that you see that other people sort of haven't noticed. They know one person notices form, Michelangelo, and someone else notices light. Someone like Monet, or suddenly you have as I said, Vermeer, somebody in the midst of a world of sort of brown pictures. You have somebody who's actually sitting up there, and brown pictures that we're painting from as more or less a formula. You suddenly have a guy who actually is starting to see a bigger spectrum. In the case of Hockney, camera notwithstanding. It must have been a help, though, I must say, because that's too unique, too different at that point. So no, I didn't try to replicate them. His methods actually are Gammell's methods are actually the academic methods. Gammell's effort, every effort, I'd have to say. He was in the midst of the Boston School. He only worked 2 years, literally, with the guys that were the keys to the Boston School. And in those 2 years, I doubt that it was more than a few months with one or both of Benson and Tarbell. He spent 15 years with Paxton, but Paxton was an academic. I mean, Paxton's entire training was outline-based noodling. Modeling, drawing is what happens between the contours kind of guy, and who was himself trying to sort of, but never really pulled it off, trying to get himself closer or get himself fully invested in the Boston School thing, or at least to get all of it that he could. But he wound up being the model that you see now in Richard Lack, where basically they use impressionist-like color, but not impressionist methods. They use academic methods and glue on impressionist color. And that's what Gammell was doing. Well, I didn't wind up there, and I wasn't trying to replicate Gammell's or anybody else's methods. I actually got where I got because I was looking for best practices to get really good color, really good light, really good drawing, and great efficiencies in getting there. And so I wound up, it doesn't surprise me, but I wound up in something like the Boston School. But then tons of people did. It actually literally was the new age of painting, say post-Manet. It was happening even before that. But when you get Carolus Duran and the attention to what Velázquez is doing, which, by the way, the academic, quote unquote, Degas said he never understood. And Millet said the same thing. Again, basically an academic in a certain way of working, outline-based, modeling up. Everything was an object, well modeled, both of them great draftsmen. But both of them said the same thing, that they didn't understand Velázquez. Well, there's something's happening here where best practices are starting to say, you know what, we're missing something when we do it this way. And there might have been other political reasons, like people might have been just fully irritated with the establishment, and that they couldn't get theirs, because it was very limited, it's very elitist. So, but you all know all these things. So how long am I going? This must be going on. I apologize. This has got to be over. So yeah, and indeed, yeah. So no, I will never be doing a Trump. I may be conservative, but I'm not interested in being an ambulance chaser. So Faye, thank you very much. Love talking with you, and I liked your very thoughtful response to the original, to my response about David. And we'll continue to differ on some subjects. Anyway, thank you all. Comment, share, subscribe, and like, and all those things. And see you next time.